paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Today, my guest is Matthew Tannan-Elgie. He is a documentary maker, and he's also pursuing a PhD at University College Dublin. He has made Mothman, the movie that never was. In 2002, Richard Gere starred in the Hollywood tour de force, The Mothman Prophecies. The legend of the Mothman started in 1966 when two gravediggers in West Virginia saw a black figure fly over their heads while digging a grave in a cemetery. They didn't know it then, but they are credited with being the first people to see the famous Mothman. How you doing, Matthew?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Tell us a little bit how you got interested in the Mothman.
Really, that's kind of like how many other people become interested in any creepy supernatural story. I think it was probably around, I don't know, 15 at the time. This was years ago. Just maybe listen to a few podcasts about, unsolved mysteries, that kind of thing. I saw the famous Robert Stack Unsolved Mysteries episode about it. And of course, the Richard Gere movie, like you mentioned, which was, I thought, a really good movie. I know it was a bit divisive. So just, like many people, just sort of, read a few books here and there, listened to a few podcasts here and there about the Mothman legend in West Virginia.
And why were you specifically attracted to the Mothman legend?
I mean, again, really just, I think like many people who are interested in it, it's a sort of timeless story that is a real, sort of classic folk tale in a way. I know it was only in the 60s that it happened, but there's so many elements of it that, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners and viewers have heard some of this before, but there's just a lot of elements in it that really encapsulate everything that's, attractive about a folk legend, about an urban legend, whatever you want to call it. You got the mystery, you got the strange creature, you've got whispers of a couple of strange deaths, but then apart from that, you have the very real deaths of the Silver Bridge disaster, which, some people like to chalk it up as being related to the Mothman legend. I personally don't think that's the case. I think that was just a very sad tragedy that happened in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where all this took place in the 60s. But, either way, as you saw in the Richard Gere film, a lot of different elements that sort of come together to form this very famous story, because now it is famous, as you know.
Well, there's Bigfoot, there's Yeti, there's the Loch Ness Monster. But Mothman has a metaphysical element that these other creatures don't have.
That is a good point. Yeah. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
And the Richard Gere movie came out in 2002, but before the Richard Gere movie came out, a number of filmmakers from LA embarked to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and they were going to make a movie called The Mothman. And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that is, to be honest, a fascinating story, and one that a lot of people who like the whole kind of supernatural mystery sort of programs, that kind of thing, aren't familiar with. In the mid-90s, there was a team of essentially video game creators, immensely talented, called the Neverhood. Some of you might be familiar with them. You might be familiar with them too, Nick, from back in the day. They created some of the most really innovative video games, I'd say, of that decade, using clay, sort of stop motion animation, things like that. The man who was the head of the Neverhood created another very famous video game at the time called Earthworm Jim, which was made into a cartoon as well back in the day. So, very popular, and they were doing very well. Steven Spielberg, I believe, was involved in some capacity in the Neverhood. DreamWorks, I think, was funding some of their video games. So Doug TenNapel, the head of the Neverhood, really wanted to make a movie. And so he wanted to, write a feature film, direct a feature film, and his crew very kindly, many of them came together to help him realize that ambition. And they chose The Legend of the Mothman, and they were going to travel Point Pleasant, West Virginia in 1997. So this was long before the Richard Gere film. This was long before Point Pleasant became the famous tourist town that it is today. It's still a very genuine town. All the locals still pretty much live there. A lot of them, very nice place. And adding to that, you also have a strong tourist element with the Mothman Festival, the Mothman Museum. You have a lot of commerce coming in from the Mothman legend, and it's lovely to see how the town has developed since the 90s. But in the 90s, when these guys from the Neverhood went to make their film, Point Pleasant was very, very different. I mean, I'm aware that I'm not from there. I'm not even American. But from talking to a lot of locals, it was not the way it is today. It was, yeah, a lot of the things that are there now just weren't there back then, and it was, probably struggling a bit more than it is today. And so the crew went there and to make their movie.
And they were captivated by a book by John Keel called The Mothman Prophecies, which came out in 1975. So I'm surmising that everyone on that crew had read that book.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, that was the case. The key people definitely did. I'm sure all the cast and crew did, and they loved it. I mean, it was, it's a crazy story. It's, really kind of sort of, how would I put it? It's a bit of a trip, I believe some would say, reading it. And as you said, there's a real kind of metaphysical element to it. I read it. I have to admit, I was a bit sort of confused in a way, but I enjoyed it. So yeah, they were captivated by that book, and Doug TenNapel wanted to kind of create his own original story inspired by that John Keel book. So he wrote a script, and they went there to film it. And their budget was maybe about I don't know, $60,000 budget, and that kind of thing. It's a small kind of indie sort of production in many ways. Although there were important people, other important people in the background as well, like Jeffrey Katzenberg from DreamWorks, and another figure who I'm trying to remember his name right now off the top of my head. I apologize, but he was in DreamWorks as well, and very, very high up in DreamWorks. So that was Marty Cohen. I remember his name, Marty Cohen. So he worked very closely with Steven Spielberg, Mark Russell, one of the producers. He worked for Bonnie Curtis, Steven Spielberg's, I think, executive or assistant. Worked very closely with Spielberg anyway. So they went there, yeah, and to make an original story out of what was, a very strange but interesting book, but not copying it, making something original, using it as an inspiration.
I see you got a David Bowie poster in the background. I was just thinking, instead of Ziggy Stardust, we could say Mothman instead of Ziggy. I think that might be have a nice ring to it.
That has a lovely ring to it. I forgot it was there.
Mothman played guitar.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, that's actually a long story. That's a family history thing going back a few decades. So long story. Won't get into it. I don't want to bore anyone. But yeah, it's a little relic. Yeah.
So these guys were youthful, and they had some money, and they were going to shoot in Point Pleasant, West Virginia for a couple of weeks. I mean, that was the plan. They had a simple plan. And whenever anybody says that they have a simple plan, you know, it's going to get a little convoluted. So these guys had a simple plan, and they had actors, and the director had written the script. And actually, I think that the script was passed up to people at DreamWorks, and they thought it was an interesting script. And then they ended up in West Point, or in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And they didn't run into the Mothman, but they ran into a different type of darkness. Tell us about that darkness.
Yeah, so this is one of the big reasons why I thought your audience would be interested in this upcoming documentary I'm making, is because the darkness that the crew ran into, it was a very different type of darkness. It was a very real type of darkness. And I haven't, mentioned this publicly before. You'll see it in the film and in the documentary when it comes out. It crept up on them, so to speak. It was absolutely in no way a reflection of the town today, to make that clear. Point Pleasant is a very, very lovely and welcoming place. I've been there, incredibly helpful people who took part in this project. Back then in the 90s in Point Pleasant and in prior decades, like many towns, there are things you can run into that you may not expect. This crew ran into that, and I learned when I was making this documentary that there was a lot more to the story of this obscure, well, relatively, I'm not going to say obscure, but unreleased, kind of indie sort of film from the 90s that, as I said, was never released and sort of mysterious. There was a lot more to it than just that. So basically the crew arrived and things were going smoothly. Very welcoming locals, staying in a lovely hotel, the Low Hotel, which I believe is still there, though I think it's actually on the market now. But it's a beautiful hotel. Great help from the locals. And they heard whispers as they were making this project. A few people would say to them in the wee hours of the morning, as it were, you just might want to be careful about certain areas just out there, in the woods. You just might want to be careful, just letting you know that. And they would sort of be, oh, why? Okay, it's interesting, and of course, well, it's the first thing that comes to mind. Oh, Mothman, something supernatural. It wasn't anything to do with that. The locals were kindly warning them, just, that there are some people who just, have a lot of interest in some areas around this region. Just be careful. So the crew did their job and they did their filming. Gradually, a few people who they would occasionally bump into, a few, not many, but a few, would make it very clear. They would say, don't film me. Make sure that my face is not in this documentary or in this film that you're making, this fictional film. Just make sure my face isn't in it. And it was interesting because one of the actors told me it wasn't, I don't want to be in it. It was specifically, you can't film me. Make sure my face isn't in this. So that maybe, caused a few complications, but they accommodated these people, obviously. They just, did what they asked and just, kept them out of it. To give you an example of when things really began to ratchet up, one night they were filming and apparently there was a, a bit of an incident in the woods, which is an area that they were warned about, where a person, actually someone who said you can't film me, turned up with a gun, turned up with an AK-47, and that was a bit of a scare, but he liked them, so they got on fine. But little things like that made them a bit on edge, as the filming went on. And then they began to sort of piece by piece get a little bit more to the whole picture of what was going on in that region at that time. which is the subject largely of this documentary that I'm making.
And Point Pleasant just happened to be the nexus of 3 organized crime families. The Pittsburgh family was involved, the Cleveland family was involved, and then there was someone from the Pittsburgh or the New Jersey family who had been a bad boy and he'd been banished to West Virginia. And they just happened to have, every store had a lot of slot machines, every store, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Well, you'll see it in the documentary, certainly, and you know, let's just say it really gives a new perspective of what is a very famous town now, particularly to people in your country in America, but also to people elsewhere. I mean, you know, I'm in Europe, and you know, I've been aware of this town and its festival for a long time. Many other people in Europe are and elsewhere, you know, gets visitors from all over the place because of this legend. So yes, what you'll see in my documentary is that there were connections. You know, there were a few people, not many, as with many towns, just a few, who were connected to the some of the families, at least, who you mentioned. What you'll see in this documentary is that the crew ran into that. The crew of this Mothman film from 1997 ran into that. It, you know, obviously made them a bit intimidated. No one was hurt, thankfully. But you know, they made their way out of there when they were finished, and you know, just kind of took it from there. But yes, that is what is going to be revealed in this documentary, and obviously is being revealed here for the first time as well. So that's, yeah.
So they didn't run into the Mothman, they ran into the Mafia.
They ran into the Mafia, or, you know, at least certainly that's been in the process of making this documentary. That's been what I've been trying to piece together. And certainly the crew have been very honest with me. The locals of the town have been very honest with me. And various people have corroborated each other's experiences from this film crew and what they saw in that town back then. You mentioned slot machines, yes. You know, there were slot machines. You'll see how that fits into what you mentioned regarding mafia activity. It was not every store, just to be clear. It wasn't every store. It was certain stores, it was certain establishments, but you know, this wasn't a thing where every local's involved in this. It's, you know, it's again, like, there are plenty of good people back then as now today. So, but there were certain people, as with many places, as I said, who were connected to certain crime families. And it went well beyond West Virginia. I will say that at this early stage, it went well beyond West Virginia. Pittsburgh seems to be the place that has mostly cropped up in this little investigation that I've been doing for 3 years, making this documentary. When I traveled to Point Pleasant last summer, a lot of that was corroborated from the locals as well. There were certain people back then, they told me, who were connected to possibly Pittsburgh. And as you'll see in the documentary that I'm making, you'll see how it fits in, how all those connections came together, that it was a nexus, as you said, of that activity.
And there's actually an article that you found that talks about organized crime seeping into West Virginia.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up, because there are quite a few articles you'll see in the film, along with a few other documents and stuff like that. The article that you might be referring to, well, one of them, I believe, was talking about, you know, the mob's interest in West Virginia. That was definitely one of the ones there. And so that definitely gave me some great information to go on, because this was from the 90s. This was long before, you know, I'd been poking my nose in this matter. And a lot of it kind of, you know, fit in with what the crew and the locals were telling me. So that was interesting. There was another article I found which was very interesting, and this had been mentioned by some of the crew, about a well-known talk show. Didn't say which one, where they had a guest who was a mafia hitman. And this person was asked, you know, something along the lines of, where's the best place to, you know, bury a body, as it were. And reportedly, this guy allegedly said Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Now, this would have been in the 1990s. That hasn't been proven. I haven't been able to track down that specific talk show. This was just a rumor that was spreading around the town at the time. A few different people were saying it, and so this reporter named Michael Taylor wrote about this alleged appearance on a talk show. And you can find that online somewhere. It'll be in the documentary. I have it, and you'll see that. But it's certainly, delving into all this really gave me a new perspective of this, as I said, now quite well known and famous town. There was no Mothman Museum back then, as I said, no Mothman Festival. There was no Richard Gere movie. The town was not as well known back then as it is now. And the developments it's made since then are just tremendous, I have to say. It's really touching to see what they've done since then. But yeah, back then, as with many places, it was different. And so these articles from that time really, that you'll see in my film, really give an interesting perspective on what may have been happening back then in the region.
Well, these guys were extremely frightened after about a week or so. I mean, they wanted to escape West Virginia in the worst possible way.
Yeah, and it's a pity because West Virginia has some beautiful scenery. You know what I mean? And as I said, lovely people, very kind. But the crew, obviously, given that some people wanted them to leave, they they wanted to leave too. And it was a pity because they really got on well with so many of the locals. They really got so much help. But as I said, back then there were some people who were not happy they were there because of what we both just mentioned, and they got out of there. They may have even left a little bit early. I'm not sure. I think they finished shooting. They finished shooting, and then they just drove back to Los Angeles very quickly.
The first time I was in West Virginia was a little spooky. I had started investigating the Franklin scandal, and Henry Vinson was living in Williamson, West Virginia, which is like a rural pocket in Southwest West Virginia. And this was my second time out with the Franklin scandal. And the first time out, I'd had a lot of heat on me and actually a death threat. So, but I knew that I had to get Henry Vinson to talk because he was very important in the story. He ran a gay escort service, and Lawrence King and Craig Spence spent thousands of dollars every month on this escort service to compromise politicians, closeted politicians. And I was acutely aware of Danny Casolaro, who has become famous because of American Conspiracy. But before American Conspiracy, a lot of people didn't know about Danny Casolaro, but I did. And that's where he died, was West Virginia. And I ended up in West Virginia, Williamson, West Virginia. And the specter of Danny Casolaro was always there with me. And I hung out a little bit, and I got Henry's direct dial number, and I called him and left a message. And I said, because I'd written him letters and tried to call, and there was no response. And I said to Henry, I'm in the neighborhood, and I'd like to talk to you. This is unsolicited, so you're not obligated to talk to me, but if you give me 10 or 15 minutes of your time, that'd be great. And we did meet, and he was impressed with the research that I'd done. And we started that was kind of the nascent spark of what became a friendship. But when I went to West Virginia, I was a little daunted because of the parting shot that had happened to me in Omaha. And here I am back on the road with it. And I'm in West Virginia in the middle of nowhere, and I know nobody. And Danny Casolaro ostensibly cut his wrists. And I was really worried that although Nick Bryant wouldn't cut his wrist, there would be a police report about Nick Bryant cutting his wrist. So that was That was my experience with West Virginia, beautiful West Virginia. And I've been back there since, not looking into anything nefarious, and I enjoyed myself.
Yeah, and West Virginia, I mean, honestly, there's so many good, hardworking people there, and what I like about it is that, we know it's not a particularly well-off state in the US, but there are so many people who are dedicated to making life better there. There are some people who have a good life there. When I was in Point Pleasant, I was pleased to see that. I mean, as with anywhere, you're going to find poverty. You're going to find some people who are not doing too well. But I was delighted to see, particularly compared to the 90s when the Neverhood made their film there and how their experiences there, how much the town had developed since then. There was a real sense of community spirit there. People were, as I said, were just so friendly, so helpful. And so I'm deeply grateful for their cooperation in making this upcoming documentary. In terms of when I went there, sure, it's easy to become a bit nervous after spending a while looking into what you're going to see in my documentary. But there was, today, honestly, to the best of my knowledge, there's no need to be regarding Point Pleasant, at least. I mean, it's, loads of people go there every year for the annual Mothman festival, and they visit the museum. So it's very different now. But anyway, so in the 90s, different time, as with many places,
But you'd come across a couple of sources that said you could get dirty deeds done dirt cheap.
That was what a couple of people alleged, probably a bit more than a couple, really. But again, they were talking about the past, and why I was tracking down those sources was because I wanted to see, well, okay, so the crew from LA have told me that that is what they heard when they were there in '97, from a few people. So what do the locals have to
That
say
it was
about
kind
that?
of like a hotbed of assassins.
They said that they heard whispers of that, and there was that newspaper article that I mentioned to you. Again, that television show segment has never been found. I don't know, is it just some crazy rumor? But certainly my reason for going to Point Pleasant last summer was to, ask the locals, as I'd done already a little bit over the phone, and Zoom and stuff like that, FaceTime, ask the locals, well, was this really happening when the crew went there? Is there any validity to this? And I got several locals on camera giving me their stories. And you will see those stories in my documentary. And I'll just say here that, yes, they corroborated a lot of what the LA guys told me.
Years ago, I wrote an article about Juarez, Mexico, probably about the same time you were born. And Juarez, a number of cartel assassins ended up in Juarez. And you could have someone assassinated. I guess that there was a glut of assassins. So you could have someone assassinated for $50 to $100, which I never really felt compelled to visit Juarez after I read that article.
Well, funnily enough, I've been to El Paso and I've literally physically seen Juarez, but I've never set foot in Juarez. I'd love to, but I'm not the most experienced traveler in the world. So, I have friends who live in El Paso and they kindly drove me around and we had a little drive by the border, that kind of thing. Have you been to Mexico, Nick? Actually, I've been meaning to ask you that.
Actually, I have, yes.
Yeah.
And, but I bypassed Juarez. After I wrote that article, I was a little skittish about Juarez. I thought to myself, why should I put myself in a hotbed of assassins if I don't need to?
Fair enough. Fair enough. At some point, it had the world's highest homicide rate. Is that right?
I don't know, but it's very corrupt in Mexico. I had one of my best friends. I played college football.
Yeah.
And one of my friends on the team that I played ended up in the NFL. And he was there for about 5 years, and you get paid pretty well in the NFL. And another guy on the team who was one of the best athletes was going to go to the NFL, but he hurt himself, which really slowed down his 40 time. But he's a big, tough dude. Both these guys are big, tough dudes. And my friend, unfortunately, he thought that his world was going to be the NFL. And when that didn't happen, he made some errant decisions about selling cocaine. And when you sell cocaine, oftentimes you have to go to federal prison. And he did go to federal prison. His mandatory minimum, I believe, was 10 years, and he did probably 8.5 years. Federal time, he got to do 85%. So anyway, he got out of prison. And actually, I should say now he's a completely reformed guy. He's he's a hardworking guy. He's a contractor. He's been very successful. Still a very good friend of mine. But he went and visited our buddy that had played in the NFL, and he had he saved his money and ended up getting a resort near Tijuana. And he kind of became like Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. I mean, he had all the, here's this huge guy, and he's got all these Mexicans working for him. And he's also into some dirty stuff. And actually, I'd met him. I'd go back to Minneapolis every Christmas when my grandma was alive, and I'd met him, and he wanted me to come down and visit him in Tijuana, but there was something about visiting him that said, this is going to be a bad idea, Nick. So I didn't visit him. But Jimmy, when he got out of prison, he visited him. And Tom and Jimmy were at Tom's resort, and they were out by the pool. And Tom said, you've always been able to take me, but I think I can take you. And Jimmy said, I just did all these years in prison. I don't want to get into a fight. And Tom said, no. Tom was pretty drunk. And Tom said, no, I think I can take you now. And my buddy said, no, man, I really don't want to get into a fight. And then Tom punched him. So Jimmy put a beating on him. And Tom called the federales. And they picked Jimmy up and put him in jail. And Jimmy didn't really do anything but defend himself. But Tom was locked into some illegitimate things. And obviously, he was greasing the federales. And they took everything from Jimmy. They took his shoes. They took his wallet. They took his watch. They took everything from him except his shirt and his pants. We're talking the police. And then they dropped him off on the corridor that brings you to San Diego. And Jimmy had to talk his way back into the country. And so that was a very fortuitous decision of mine, not to visit Tom's resort in Mexico.
You didn't want to end up like what's his name, Martin Sheen from Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, Tom. I think Tom kind of. Well, I think because there's this big white guy, and he controls all these littler guys. All these smaller Mexican guys work for him, and. But then I think that there was a lot of drinking involved, and maybe some other things that made him so crazy. And but I did go to Mexico after Jimmy's experience, but I bypassed Tom's resort.
Fair enough.
So these guys that made this movie, would you say by the end of shooting this that these guys were terrified?
From speaking to them, yes, of course. I mean, this was not a situation that would be easy for any filmmakers, any creatives, let alone a group of young filmmakers. They were making their first feature film. This was not an easy situation they were in. In the documentary that's coming out soon, you will see the fear that they went through. I have footage of their shoot, which will be in this documentary. You will see their immediate reactions after running into some potentially quite hairy situations. You'll see that happening in the documentary. You'll see their testimony that they gave me about what they heard, about what was going on there at that time, what they saw when they were there, and you'll see some footage from the shoot, which will prove a lot of their claims and a lot of the claims of illegal activity that some people were involved in. And as I said, this is something that goes on in many, many cities and many towns. It's just unfortunately, if you're a film crew coming to film somewhere, you anywhere like that, you may have trouble with them. That's what these guys ran into. And you'll see that in the film. You'll see footage that one of the actors took during the shoot, proving a lot of this.
You had referenced this earlier in the interview, but I kind of got a kick out of this. So they were shooting in a place, in an establishment, and one guy said, "Don't shoot me," but he was very polite. He said, don't put me in your movie. Don't point the camera near me." But he was very, very polite, and he seemed like a gentleman. Didn't want to be in the movie. And then I believe it was that night or a couple of nights later, he was the guy that came running towards them with the AK-47.
That was the guy who came running at them with an AK-47. You're absolutely right. And as I said, he liked them. They ended up getting on fine. Nothing bad happened. But just picture being in these guys' shoes. This was the age before mobile phones were ubiquitous. I think one of them was trying to desperately call the producer on a walkie-talkie, just like, "Hey Jay," that's the producer's name, Jay Holben, great guy. He's like, "Jay, there's a guy with an AK-47 standing in the woods just right there, and it's dark. It's probably, I don't know, midnight, and he's staring at me," he said. And so then obviously that caused quite a ruckus, and they were scrambling to see what was going on and just make sure that Adrian, the electrician, who saw him first, was okay. And he was okay. It was all fine. It's just that it was a bit unclear why exactly is this man with an AK-47 so interested in what we're doing and is out here in the middle of nowhere. And it just so happens to be the same man who was in the establishment earlier saying, "You can't film me. Make sure my face isn't in this film that you're doing." So make of that what you will. We alluded to it earlier, but you will, that's just the taste of some of the odd behavior that they ran into. And you'll see why they ran into so much odd behavior and why it was so important to a few select people that they did not walk around with cameras any more than they should be doing. Let's put it that way. That was a few people's perspective. Yeah.
They were edified. That particular.
They were edified. They were edified. And this documentary will fully edify people about what was going on in the town back then. Yes.
I've interacted with some mafiosi, and as long as you don't enmesh yourself with them with money, they're generally pretty polite. But I mean, you've got to keep in mind that there's a very dark side. I've had a lot of strange days in my life, but I think one of the strangest was I interviewed the former boss of the Lucchese crime family at the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. And the Supermax is called the Rock of the Rockies. It's like the new Alcatraz, except they don't got them on an island. They've got them in the middle of a mountain. And they took a handprint for me. And then I went through a couple of checkpoints where I had to put my hand against a plate that established my identity. And then, I'm waiting there, and here comes Anthony Gaspipe Casso, who the feds had said was responsible for 36 homicides. I think that they were overestimating his homicides, but I mean, I don't dispute that the guy was a killer, and he would kill you if there was a reason. But that was a very interesting. So I spent the day with him, and then he told me this wild story about hiring NYPD detectives who moonlighted as hitmen, highly decorated NYPD detectives that moonlighted as hitmen. So the feds had made him out to be a pathological liar. Now, you can be a sociopath or psychopath. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a pathological liar. You can tell the truth. When I've dealt with that type of element, they can be open, but they tend not to incriminate themselves. Gaspipe did not have that problem, for the most part, of incriminating himself. And he told me about these detectives that he used for hits. And when I got back to New York, I started digging into the story, and I started turning over rocks. And investigations are kind of interesting. You start turning over little rocks, and then if there's something under there, then you turn over a little bit bigger rocks. And I ultimately got an FBI document that talked about those guys doing hits and other corroboration. And I wrote an article about those guys doing hits. And the editor said to me, we can't publish this, Nick. These guys are highly decorated NYPD detectives. We can't accuse them of murder. And this was in 1999. In 2005, they were indicted for doing hits for Gaspipe. And I used to have, every Saturday I'd have breakfast with he was kind of a mentor of mine, really great guy, Jerry. And I said, man, I've been trying to break this story for 6 years, and now it's finally out there. And he said, well, now you can sell your story. And I did in fact sell the story to Playboy. And although I want to say this parenthetically, I did not know about Hugh Hefner's behavior when I wrote that story. And actually, the editor at Playboy was a very good editor. But so I finally sold this story about these two cops that were hitmen, and Gaspipe and I kept in touch, but the feds really didn't like us talking too much after that. They after those cops got indicted, they would not let me talk to Gaspipe anymore, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you've lived an adventurous life, and certainly, reading your work was one of the things that inspired me to go on this strange journey. As I said, it's taken a while, but it's nearly finished. This documentary, you'll all be seeing it soon, and I hope you enjoy it. But I mean, certainly the revelations in it are quite mind blowing. Without wanting to be sensationalist about it, I mean, it really gives a new perspective of the recent history of this famous town. And certainly there's a lot of intrigue that the crew stumbled into, and that subsequently the locals have informed me about all these years later. And that tale of intrigue, it's gonna really shock some people. It really is.
What's interesting is the big Hollywood movie that got made in 2002 was a complete game changer for that community. Now they have a Mothman museum, and there's a Mothman statue, and you can buy Mothman trinkets. So it's very different now than it was then.
Extremely. Those Mothman cookies are some of the tastiest things I've ever had in my life.
I didn't know about the Mothman cookies. No. Wow.
There's something else, and that says it all about how the town has changed since the 90s and 80s and 70s, etc. What was happening there was going on for a while, and you'll see information related to that in the documentary about how long that sort of stuff was going on in the town, where it connected to, a few certain people who were based in that town at the time and their connections, including their out of state connections. Um, I'd even go so far as to say that those connections were household names, and I'm going to say in a bad way, if you know what I mean. Now, you mentioned a few people earlier. That's certainly. I apologize for being opaque about it. It's just that obviously the documentary is not out yet, and you'll see what those connections were fully when it's out, and it's going to blow your mind. I mean, it blew my mind. And you'll see testimony from people very, very knowledgeable, very respected people in the town talking about it as well. So,
well, Matthew, I want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast. And I want to say to my viewers and listeners, if you're ever in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, don't forget about the Mothman cookies, because Matthew attests that they're quite delicious.
yeah, and I've got sort of weird interests, but you can take my word for it. They're pretty
Okay.
good.
Well, have yourself a great day, Matthew.
Thank you so much. And you can find the trailer for the documentary at Commendable Commotion, if anyone wants to see the trailer.
We'll put your links up, okay? Some of your links, and we'll put them up.
Thanks so much.
And take care.
Take care.
Okay, bye.